Okay, thank you. Good evening and welcome to Homes and Safe Communities Scrutiny Committee. May I remind everyone present that the meeting will be recorded via the internet and this recording archived for future viewing. Could all participants please mute themselves when not speaking in order to avoid any background noise or feedback when other participants are speaking? If a participant wishes to speak, can they please put their hand up if they can be seen on screen, or use the hand up or chat function. If any participant has difficulty hearing or being heard when they are addressing the committee, then they should let the chairman or democratic officer know. If they have a webcam, then they should try turning this off, as this will help with broadband or Wi-Fi bandwidth, so they at least can hear and be heard. Please ensure that all debate is raised verbally and not via the chat function for the sake of the recording. The chat function may be used the chat function may be used to highlight any technical issues and or to grab the attention of the chairman or democratic services officer. Thank you.
Just wanted to add very quickly, Chair, just to let members know that we'll be holding a minute's silence after the apologies for absence for His Royal Highness Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. Basically, I'll let people know when the minute starts, and then I'll let yourself know when it finishes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So item 1 on the agenda is apologies for absence. Do we have any?
Yes, Chair, we have Bronwyn Brooks, Councillor Bronwyn Brooks. She will be late for the meeting. She's on her way, and should be here shortly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Chair, we also have Councillor Leighton Rowlands and also Mrs. Gina Doyle and Mr. Anthony Raybould from the Tenant Representative Group.
Okay, thank you. I think that's it. So.
Okay, Chair, what I'll do then is, bear with me a second, I will start the minute silence now if everyone's happy for this to start. Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, I'll start that now. The minute is now over, Chair.
Thank you. Agenda item number 3, receive declarations of interest. Do we have any? I am assuming that is a no. Thank you very much. Okay, so the next item on the agenda is the Gypsy and Traveller Site Search update. We do have some public speakers in tonight regarding this, but before we give them a chance to speak, I'd like to hand this over to my officers for an update. So, Mike, if you would like to kick it off, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. This is a reference from Cabinet on Monday, the 22nd of March. The report before Cabinet attempted to update Cabinet on suitable sites to meet long-term needs for gypsies and travellers in the Vale of Glamorgan and suggested a preferred way ahead. It also reported on the outcome for the public call for candidate sites for gypsy and travel use that was approved by Cabinet on the 20th of January and undertaken by the Council from the 17th of February.
Sorry, Mike, can I just interject very quickly? Sorry, Chair, we've missed an agenda item.
I was just
the minutes of the last meeting. I think before we obviously properly start, we should obviously approve those or not. Obviously,
Yeah. That's actually not on the it's actually not on the agenda sheet I've got here on my papers, so it's been missed off the sheet, I think. But
it's on my copy, Chair. I don't know why that has happened. But yeah, if we can, right, okay. If we can obviously do that now, Chair, if it's possible, just before.
yes, okay. Are we happy to approve the minutes of the last meeting?
Yes.
Yes, happy to approve.
Okay, thank you. All right, so sorry, Mike, you may carry on now.
I'll just recap. So this is a reference from Cabinet on the 22nd of March 2021. The report before Cabinet updated members on the attempts to identify a suitable site to meet long-term needs for the gypsies and travellers in the Vale of Glamorgan and suggested a preferred way ahead. It also reported on the outcome of the public call for candidate sites and further consultation work that was undertaken by the council in February and March 2020. The report set out the way forward for the council to address the identified long-term gypsy and travel accommodation needs in the Vale and the matters and issues related to those proposed options. Cabinet resolved that the report be noted, that options available to the council also be noted, that the report be referred to Homes and Safe Community Scrutiny Committee for consideration, with any comments being reported back to Cabinet for further consideration, subject to comments of Homes and Safe Communities Scrutiny Committee, that the Strategic Housing Board further investigate the permanent use of land at Hayes Road, Sully, to include detailed site investigations, discussions to progress potential purchase of any additional necessary land to facilitate the development, and submission of a planning application for the development, and a final recommendation or resolution that a further report then be presented back to Cabinet following those investigations, and that report to include, if necessary, procurement of necessary land to deliver a suitable site by negotiation or compulsory purchase. The background for members' information to the report: the need for a permanent site for gypsy and traveller community has long been identified as a strategic priority for the council, and to remind members that where a need has been identified through assessment, the council is under a statutory duty under the Housing Wales Act 2014 to meet that need. In order to identify the need, we engaged consultants in 2016, Opinion Research Services, who undertook a gypsy traveller accommodation assessment in accordance with Welsh Government guidelines. That assessment was adopted by Cabinet in June 2016 and was further, following minor amendment and clarification, was approved by Welsh ministers in March 2017. The Gypsy and Traveller Accommodation Assessment, of course, is extremely important because that provides the evidence base which led into the Council's Local Development Plan 2011-2026. And what the report concluded was that a total of 2 pitches were required in the short to medium term, i.e. the first 5 years, and that a further 18 pitches were required for the remainder of the plan period to 2026, the long-term need. Since the adoption of the Gypsy Travel Accommodation Assessment, the short-term need has been met through private provision, and as part of the work, a programme of intended actions to meet the longer-term need was included in our LDP monitoring framework and was subject to public examination. The annual monitoring report, which is published on the 31st of October each year, is used to monitor the implementation of the LDP and can be a material consideration in planning decisions. The original Gypsy and Traveller Accommodation Board, which has now been subsumed into the Strategic Housing Board, which was established in September 2016, members will be aware that contact had been made and we've maintained with the occupiers of the Hayes Road site. Unfortunately, however, we've not been able to identify a suitable site by the target date included in the original LDP. Cabinet previously considered a proposal, you'll be aware, at Hayeswood Road as the preferred site to meet the long-term Gypsy and Traveller needs. However, following consideration by this committee and further consideration by Cabinet in October 2018, Cabinet determined that the recommendation for the site at Hayeswood Road be rejected, and that officers continue to look for alternative options. As part of that, a new Gypsy and Traveller site selection process was undertaken, which is included within the report, that could deliver a permanent traveller site to address the long-term accommodation needs identified in the Gypsy and Traveller accommodation assessment. I think it's worth pointing out at this stage that the Gypsy and Traveller accommodation assessment is a 5-year assessment. It looks to plan for the needs for the next 5 years. The council would have, other than the circumstances of the last 12 months, would have been required to undertake a new Gypsy and Traveller accommodation assessment this year. However, given those circumstances, Welsh Government have notified the council that a new assessment will be required by February 2022. In terms of the key issues of consideration and the detail and basis of the report, I'll hand you over to Vicky Robinson at this stage, committee. Vicky and Vicky staff have been involved obviously in terms of the call for sites and further work in terms of identifying alternative sites, and Vicky will take you through the rest of the report.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, for those of you that don't know me, I'm the operational manager for planning and building control, and part of our function is to deliver the local development plan, and this identification of Gypsy and Traveller need and then meeting that need falls under the local development plan work, in addition to it being a statutory function under the Housing Act, and hence the sort of dual officer involvement here and dual representation on the Strategic Housing Board. As Mike has already sort of set out, we have been looking at this project for quite some considerable time, obviously in the preparation and run up to the LDP and since. And initially that work very much focused on council owned land and the idea that it would be most feasible to deliver a site on land already within the council's ownership and control, where we would have the ability to deliver a site. So that was the starting point. That work has already been set out in previous reports to Cabinet back in 2018 when the Hayeswood Road site was identified as the preferred site, but thereafter rejected by this committee and by Cabinet. So that work set out really the exhaustive assessment of council owned land. Following that, then we obviously attempted to look at other means of procuring land. So we undertook a call for sites, and that was undertaken between February and March 2020. Extensive local press advertisement and relevant property press advertisement, social media, direct contact with relevant representative bodies, town councils, landowners, etc., to try and see if we could establish some interest from the private sector to put forward sites that might be potential development sites. And that unfortunately resulted in no sites coming forward. Following that, we then looked at whether or not there was the possibility that we could purchase land. So we were looking to see what land was available on the open market that might be suitable. And, you know, we have continued to do that and will continue to do that through the Strategic Housing Board. But as a sort of point in time, that exercise was done back in December last year, identifying potential suitable sites and writing to the landowners and representatives of sites that were up for sale that could potentially be explored. And again, that resulted in no interest coming back to us. So, you know, we are struggling to identify sites through all those various means. The report also sets out our potential powers in terms of compulsory purchase, but, you know, does set out the inherent difficulties of doing that on a sort of very wide and broad basis, and the potential risk of challenge and how you go about identifying a suitable site for compulsory purchase and so on. And so that assessment and that journey has really led us to the options as set out in the paper and the conclusion that it is worth revisiting the existing tolerated site at Sully. And for members that are not familiar, potentially, if I can just attempt to share my screen, I will just show you a plan of the site that we are referring to here. Can everyone see that? Let me know if you can't. I'm going to assume you can.
Yeah,
great, thank you. So what this plan shows, which is an appendix to the Cabinet report, it clearly shows the site edged in blue is roughly where the existing tolerated site is, so where the existing Hayes Road occupiers are currently living and have been living for almost 10 years. And then the site edged red, the sort of larger portion of that, is what was previously identified through the local development plan as being the potential Gypsy and Traveller site back then, as set out in the report. So this is the area in the site that we're talking about. The plan here also shows hatched green is land that is in the council's ownership and control. So obviously it extends from Hayes Road to the coast. The purple hatched land to the east of the site is in private ownership, and the orange hatched land is Welsh Church Act land, so also outside the council's ownership or control. The plan also shows adopted highway and areas that are covered by flood zone. And as you'll see in the report, you know, the reason this site was considered and rejected by the LDP inspector through his examination in public was because the site access as is, the vehicular access to the north of the site onto Hayes Road is at risk of flooding. It's in what we call zone C2 for the purposes of technical advice note 15, which is the policy document on flooding. And what that document basically says is that no vulnerable development should be located within flood zone. So that would include residential development and a Gypsy and Traveller. Any residential accommodation associated with the Gypsy and Traveller use should be not in that flood zone. And the inspector also, you know, pointed out that vehicular access should therefore also not be within the flood zone. To ensure that safe emergency access can get into and out of the site at the time of flooding. So what the Cabinet report and the sort of Housing Board have considered is a potential is to see whether or not that constraint, which was the reason for that site being dismissed several years ago by the appeal inspector, whether or not that constraint can be overcome through either purchase or through negotiation or compulsory purchase of land adjacent to this site to enable access. Hence, this plan is shown, you know, demarking the sort of private land in between the site and the area of adopted highway up here, where that is not affected by flooding, is not in the flood zone. So this report at this stage merely, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen, sorry, hopefully, there we go. So the purpose of this Cabinet report and for your consideration is to say this is worth further investigation. That's what the recommendation alludes to. It obviously would require formal consents, formal processes to go through, for example, a planning application, and further reports would be necessary to go back to Cabinet once this exploration has gone through site investigation works, potentially a planning application, and the outcome of that process would need to then have further consideration by Cabinet. So hopefully that proceeds how we've got to where we've got to and why this Cabinet report has been presented and why the recommendations are what they are. I know there are public speakers, so I'm sure we'll come back and answer any queries that members have after that. So I'll leave it there. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mike and Victoria, for that. As Victoria just mentioned, we do have some public speakers tonight. So we've got 5 people who want to speak on this. So the way we're going to handle this is we're going to have Mr. Richard Thomas, then Mr. Stephen Thomas, then Councillor Christopher Tatt all speak, and officers or Cabinet members can come back on anything raised there. Then we will ask for Councillor Bob Penrose and Councillor Kevin Marnie to come in after that. Thank you. So the first person to speak is Mr. Richard Thomas. If you could please just bear in mind that you have 3 minutes. So I'm sure our democratic officers will let you know if you're nearing your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, Mr. Thomas.
Yes, we can hear you.
My name is Richard Thomas. As I said, I'm a chartered architect and a retired government planning inspector, and I represent Our Future Community, a group that's preparing a place plan for Surrey on behalf of the Community Council. There are 2 objections to this proposal. The first one is of land use. The Community Council obtained planning permissions in 2016 for allotments, a scheme put forward to meet a long-established need within the village, and one that's widely supported by residents, and the permission will be renewed shortly. It's a use that will be completely in accordance with the Council's recently published Project Zero draft plan, for example. This says that the Council aims to provide green infrastructure in the Vale and to provide to promote sustainable food systems through, amongst other things, increasing the number of allotments. So a valid permission exists for development that would meet identified local community need in total conformity with adopted and emerging policies, and it could be implemented immediately without recourse to any additional land purchase. The Gypsy and Traveller site could be sited anywhere else in the Vale, but the proposed community allotments could not be. The second objection concerns the practicalities of gaining access to the site, avoiding the flooded Hills Road. Beechwood College site is highly developed. Obviously, you have to go around that using private land and the Welsh Church Act's land. The glebe field is in the ownership of the Welsh Church Act's trust, and it puts the trustees in a dilemma in having to follow the Charity Commission's requirement to obtain best value. If they agreed a sale, the road and the proximity of the proposed site would significantly reduce its value as a housing site. Alternatively, if the council resorted to compulsory purchase, the trustees only receive its current value as agricultural land and a reduction in its future value as housing site. But apart from the trustees' dilemma, the creation of a new access without detailed consideration of the spatial requirements of any future potential development of the glebe field, whether housing or for a library and health centre as proposed by local groups, or any other use, would place a considerable restriction on any such development, affecting both its layout and cost and the effect of the Welsh Church Act's trustees. In summary, the proposed enlargement of the Gypsy and Traveller site would prevent the creation of a much needed community facility, and the creation of a new access would face considerable practical problems and would effectively blight any future development on the neighbouring land. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thomas. Okay, I'm going to bring Mr. Stephen Thomas in now. Mr. Thomas, you do have 3 minutes if you would like to start speaking. Thank you.
Good evening. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you for letting me speak this evening. My name is Stephen Thomas. I'm a chartered surveyor with experience in property development and particularly compulsory purchase. And I'm here this evening representing the Sully and Lavenock group, of which I'm chair. I've read the various reports that have been undertaken by the Vale Council in regard to Gypsy and Traveller, and the report referred to taking into consideration such things as sustainability, health and well-being, together with growth, access to utilities. But the author of the report is now suggesting that you go to the Welsh Government to ask if they will relax and reduce these standards. A bit bizarre, I think, seeing that an officer earlier said that you were complying with the Welsh Government guidelines. I'll move on now to the site search report. I'm not sure whether the author of this report fully understands CPO procedures. Just because you have a site which might have a tenancy on it or is common land, it does not, I'll repeat, does not preclude it from a CPO. The site identification report discounted Hayes Road site due to its location within the C2 flood zone. The LDP inspector, Richard Jenkins, took the same view. This site report also discounted sites in Ogmore because it was in C2 flood zone, land at Southern Down because it was common land, and yet Hayes Road has now risen from the ashes. So where is the preferred site from the original report? When that site owner was a willing seller, planning was not a problem, and more importantly, there would be no need to relax the rules and regulations of the Welsh Government. There is no mention in this report as to the likely cost of providing a site, whether it be a substandard one or, more importantly, a compliant one. There is also no mention of what possible land acquisition costs might be. If my staff had given me a report like this in my position that I held for numerous years, I would have thrown the report out. Hayes Road is outside the settlement boundary of the village. Exactly the same reason given when planning was refused for residential development on the BP sports field in Sully. I'll now take you back a bit further in time when this site was occupied by Biffa Waste, which was vacated when they moved to the new site. Surely they had a duty of care to hand back the site to the Vale Council with vacant possession and in
Sorry, Chair. Sorry, Mr. Thomas, you've just gone over your 3 minutes.
Okay.
Are you ready to sort of, if the Chair is happy, just to finish off?
I got a couple of lines to say if you would let me do it. If not, I understand.
Okay, if you would like to just quickly finish off then,
Okay.
Thank you.
Surely this site should have been handed back in a good condition with vacant possession. I therefore would urge the committee to review what is being proposed before any more mistakes are made which might affect the authority's reputation. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Our next speaker is Councillor Christopher Tatt. Again, you have 3 minutes if you would like to come in. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm muted. Can you hear me?
I can hear you and I can see you.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, councillors and officers. My name is Christopher Tatt. I'm the Vice Chair of Sully and Lavenock Community Council. I'm a retired person. I was former General Manager in a large international company. The Sully and Lavenock Community Council have a legal duty to provide allotments of residents under the provisions of the 1908 Small Holdings and Allotment Act, which is still the governing legislation on allotments in the UK. The Sully and Lavenock Community Council strongly object to the proposal to create a permanent Gypsy and Traveller site on land which we have a planning permission for community allotments. I'd like to emphasise that point. We have planning permission on that site. The background information is as follows. In 2008, the Surrey and Lebanon Community Council started discussions with the Vale of Glamorgan officers Phil Beeman and Miles Punter. The discussions concerned returning the land behind Hayes Road Recycling Centre back to its original use as an allotment site following high resident demand. The discussions were constructive and with goodwill on both sides. The proposed allotment site is alongside Beechwood College, the only college in Wales for students with autism and Asperger's syndrome. The college were very interested in using some of the allotments as they will provide excellent therapy and training for students, as a career in gardening services is one of the main work opportunities for them. A planning application was submitted but refused on the grounds that the site had been put into the draft LDP as a permanent Gypsy and Traveller site. Pardon me. The LDP hearing proposals for the Gypsies and Travellers site was swiftly rejected by the inspector. So the Surrey and Lebanon Community Council resubmitted the allotment planning application and was successful. And as I said earlier, the application to have allotments there is still valid. The council were unable to make progress on the development of the site due to the unauthorised occupation of the Travellers. A meeting was held on the 29th of September 2017 with the Vale of Glamorgan. The agreed purpose of the meeting was to discuss how to make progress in respect of the development of allotments at Hayes Road, Surrey. Present at the meeting were the Vale of Glamorgan Managing Director, Robert Thomas, Miles Punter, Director of Environment and Housing, Marcus Goldsworthy, Head of Planning. The meeting was constructive and very encouraging. On the 10th of November 2017, your Managing Director, Robert Thomas, sent a letter to the Surrey Community Council summarising the meeting. The letter concluded with the following statements. The Council welcomes the interest in the site and your plans for the future use of the site for the purposes of community allotments. In this regard, notwithstanding the work needed to provide an alternative traveller site, I am content to offer support to any application for your lottery funding. In this regard, I'm also content for you to use this letter in any application made. I trust this is of use to you and look forward to discussing the matter further. I'm sure you'll agree this is very strong encouragement and support from the top Vale of Glamorgan officer. Since we've heard nothing about the removal of the unauthorised occupiers of the site, so that the Surrey and Lebanon Community Council may carry out their legal duties and responsibilities.
Sorry, Councillor, just to interject there, you've gone over the 3 minutes now. Chair, are you happy for the councillor to just sort of wrap up his statement, or? I
have one sentence to go.
I'm quite happy for you to quickly finish off and wrap up. No problem. Thank you.
My last sentence, thank you, Chair. My last sentence is really to you. As a Scrutiny Committee, don't you have a responsibility to help and assist community councils fully respect their legal obligations? The Surrey and Lebanon Community Councils ask you for that help now. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you, Councillor Tatt. I'll now go back to our officers and possibly cabinet members, as I understand we do have one or two in tonight. Do you have any points that you would like to come back on? Who, if anybody would like to speak? Yes, go ahead, Victoria. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'll just start by just addressing quite a number of the issues that have been raised there by the public speakers. I would say would be given full consideration in due course through the planning application process. As I indicated in my introduction, this is the start of an appraisal in terms of further consideration of the constraints on the site, and the members of the public speaking have identified a number of those potential constraints that need further exploration. That that's part of the recommendation of the cabinet report, that those matters need further consideration and addressing, and much further wider public consultation would need to be undertaken as part of that process. So this is very much the start of a process to explore whether or not this site can be given further consideration. So hopefully that sort of does offer some assurance that this is not a done deal in terms of the Cabinet report or dismissal of any of those considerations that have been given. The point about land acquisition and costs, which also is partially combined with the issue around grant funding and subsidy and how the council would pay for the delivery of the Gypsy and Traveller site. And quite rightly, one of the members of the public has alluded to the fact that the report doesn't go into any detail about that, and nor should it at this point in time, because it is not a firm proposal to confirm this as being the final site or what the project looks like or how much it's going to cost. All of those matters need to be given further exploration through site investigations, potential things that come up through the planning application process and so on. So, you know, we have alluded to the fact that there is government grant available. We've been liaising with Welsh Government officials over that grant. And when I say we, collective we, it's really the housing officers here that would liaise with Welsh Government over the availability of grant subsidy to deliver the project. And if necessary, because it's a statutory duty, the council may well have to deliver it through its own capital programme, and that is acknowledged in the report. So, you know, those matters are not ignored, but they are for further consideration down the line, not necessarily essential at this point in time, given the recommendations and the framework in the report. I don't know if Mike has anything else to add on those points.
Just to concur, really, this is about exploration of the site and the opportunity and potential going forward. A further report would be subject, I think, to Cabinet's consideration in terms of whether this remains or otherwise a viable option based on that exploration. In terms of the funding position, Welsh Government confirmed that as things stand, funding would still be made available to local authorities to deliver sites. Just to pick up on the one point in relation to relaxation of standards, I think was referred to. The guidance that Welsh Government have produced is non-statutory guidance. It is guidance, and the indication that in our discussions with the traveller groups, which actually came on the back of Scrutiny's consideration of this matter a couple of years ago. I think Councillor Marnie and others at the meeting were aware that relationships, I suppose, with the community there hadn't been particularly strong. Now, those subsequent to that, there have been positive meetings with the community with regard to their aspirations and needs, and of course we can't consider people as a community in the generic term. People who are currently occupying the site are individuals in their own right, and they have different needs and aspirations in relation to the future. However, what was common to those discussions was that the residents there wanted to be involved in discussions that affected them and their futures, which I think is quite right and natural, and in the same way as any other resident of the Vale of Glamorgan would be involved in the same way. In terms of a council-owned site, clearly there would be requirements that we would wish to ensure as part of any site that we did develop, and certainly health and safety and other aspects clearly would be a non-negotiable option that we wouldn't be prepared to move on. There are also other requirements in terms of council-owned sites, again, which we've discussed with Welsh Government officials over the last couple of years, with regard to requirements under the mobile homes legislation, which of course for any approved site, any delivered site would be we would need to ensure. So as I say, just to reassure members, this wouldn't be necessarily a case of here is a site, get on with it, and the council as landowner would obviously be involved in discussions with the travellers and with Welsh Government in relation to an appropriate design for the site. And of course, we would want to involve the local community at Sully in those discussions as well. Clearly, we want to ensure that there are good relations between the community there and the rest of the Sully community. And as Victoria's mentioned, they have been resident on the site for quite a considerable number of years now, you know, that there have not been any fundamental issues in terms of their occupation. On a final point, you know, the council, there was mention of Biffa and the previous use of the site. It's always been a council-owned site. The council retained the license, the waste license for the site, and obviously Biffa undertook the work on the site. The site was returned, or the site obviously returned to the council following its use as a recycling centre, and the licence conditions have been met in terms of NRW, so that there are no longer any waste conditions actually referring or relating to that site, and National Resources Wales, as I say, returned the licence to the Vale of Glamorgan.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Mike and Victoria. I do have Margaret's hand up, so Councillor Wilkinson, if you would like to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, everybody. I'm Councillor Margaret Wilkinson, Cabinet Member for Homes and Safety and Building. I'd just like to say that this is not a done deal. That is why we had a long discussion in Cabinet, and the recommendations that definitely would go to Homes and Safety Scrutiny Committee for their comments, and we would listen to their comments and when it was sent back. Now, there is more investigation to do. We're not just going to walk in there and do it. There is more investigations to do, and we have to go and listen to everybody. So please, everybody, don't think this is a done deal at this very moment. We have a long way to go yet. And I want to listen to everybody, and I will take on board what people are saying, and especially from this scrutiny committee. I'm waiting for their comments to come back to the Cabinet, and we will then see what will happen in the next phase. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Wilkinson. If there are no other officers or Cabinet members who wish to speak at the moment, I'll go on to the next two speakers who are registered.
Sorry, Chair. Councillor Eddie Williams would like to has put his hand up.
Oh yes, sorry. Okay. Thank you, Thank you, Councillor Williams. Go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry about that, Chair. I was a bit late putting that up. It's just I want to talk with Councillor Wilkinson, the Armed Cabinet for Plan and Regulation. We know that this has been ongoing for some time, and it is a wicked issue. We know, you know, I'm hearing the views tonight, and I've learned stuff, particularly regarding previous applications. I wasn't quite aware of those, and also the support for the allotment. I'll be honest. I am a bit concerned that, you know, we've got residency, we've got people in the current area. So I understand that that'll have to be resolved if we move forward with the allotment. So, but by all means, as Council and the officers have put forward, that's what the purposes of this report is, to bring that forward, to get your views, but also to open up the consultation process. We do need to come up with an answer. This has been going on for far too long now, and you know, the uncertainty, particularly from the Community Council. You know, they could have been in there many years ago, but of course we've got the people on the land at the moment, so it's not been resolved in that way. So I'm hoping that this process will kick that, and we'll have an answer from it in the near future, rather than this indeterminate situation that we've got at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. Councillor Tatt, could you please mute yourself and turn off your camera? Thank you. The next people we have scheduled to speak are two Vale councillors, and they are the ward members. So the first person on the list is Councillor Bob Penrose. You have 5 minutes if you would like to start. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you, Chair, for affording me the opportunity to address your committee tonight. I've read the report, and frankly, I consider it quite ludicrous that the Vale of Glamorgan Council should even be considering reinvestigating this candidate site on Hayes Road, Sully, for all the following reasons. Firstly, as been pointed out by one of the residents, as a residential development, which a Gypsy traveller site permanent would be, it is outside of the residential settlement boundary for Sully by quite a while, nearly half a mile actually. Also, which there's no reference in the report, it is in the blast zone of the Dow Corning Chemical Works in Barry, and this is for residential safety. If you put an application in inside the blast zone for housing, you wouldn't get it, yet we're prepared to sacrifice the health and safety of these people by allowing a permanent traveller site, which to me is totally wrong. The candidate site was rejected by Welsh Government, as been pointed out by Victoria at the LDP hearings by one of the planning inspectors for Wales, as the lower part of the site, and let's stress the lower part of the site, not just the entrance, the lower part of the site is in a C2 floodplain and contravened TAN 15 regulations. In fact, the inspector pointed out it should never have been brought by competent planning officers as an application in the first place. And now we're adding insult to injury, and flying in the face of the Welsh Government planning inspector's ruling seems to me to be totally foolhardy. I also found out that the flood zone has flooded twice in the last 12 months. And in the last instance, on the 23rd of December, when we had tremendous flooding in Sully, it was flooded to a depth of several feet, where the Hayes Road and the Gypsy Traveller site was closed for 4 days. They could have no access to the candidate site. Now, the notion of purchasing land on an adjoining site, which incidentally was rejected as residential land by a planning inspector because it was in a breach of TAN 15, in order to create a new road access to the candidate site is ludicrous. The site I refer to is what we in Sully call the old tank site. And initially, we were of the belief that that new road was going to go through that ground and be a joint entrance and exit with T-Haven Hospice. But that still wouldn't avoid a situation that when Hayes Roads flood, there is no access to Sully for anybody along Hayes Road, and that includes his Hayes Point and the new proposed housing developments we have there. Unless, of course, the council are recommending that residents break the law and go through ABP docks, which is a private road and clearly states it's only for access to businesses on the actual docklands. It hasn't been thought out. Tonight we hear that consideration is being given to the glebe fields and land behind the Beechwood College for autism. I find that very ironical as a trustee of the Sully Community Library Trust, when we applied to the Welsh Church Estate Act to buy land to build a new health centre for the community, a new library and a large car park to serve many of the businesses and the old school, where at the moment there's only main road parking and causes a lot of problems. The trustees of the Welsh Church Estate Act Committee, and I sat in on the meeting as an observer, were advised by legal and planning officers of the Vale of Glamorgan Council that they were obliged to take the best price for the land and should not sell it to ourselves as agricultural land, albeit that we'd offered overage, which means if we had planning permission, we would pay an extra amount of money should that planning permission be attained. And so they've stopped community activities, which are very, very important to Sully, and now propose buy-ins it, possibly by compulsory purchase, to create a new road. I find that quite ironical. The report also doesn't make any references to the large number of objections from residents that came forward last time and from Beechwood College itself that find the illegal traveller site at the moment to the detriment of their students at the college. The report also ignores the fact that the candidate site is on an access road to the Vale of Glamorgan Council's All Tides slipway, which facilitates emergency services, rescues at sea and on the coastline. The report suggests there are no alternative suitable sites in the Vale of Glamorgan, making reference to which I see as a seemingly half-hearted attempt made to acquire any private sites. And yet I've been approached subsequently by a syndicate who offered a site.
I do apologise, but I need to interrupt you there. You've gone past your 5 minutes. If you would like to very quickly sum up, thank you.
Okay, I'll make it very brief. There was a site offered at the boys' camp in East Aberthaw, of which the council never responded to the owners of the site. Neither does the report refer to council-owned sites such as the Alps, Court Road, Llangarn, all which could be suitable for Gypsy traveller sites. I find it quite objectionable that this is being raised again without consultation, and I do not take aboard all the planning officer's comments that they'll look at these things and come back. To my mind, before this was even proposed, all these things should have been investigated thoroughly and given due hearing as with a public consultation. I thank you for your patience, Chair, and I sincerely hope that the committee members will think before they actually decide on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Penrose. Our next speaker is Councillor Marnie, and once he has finished, I will do as I did with the other three speakers and go back to the officers and cabinet members that may wish to speak. So, Councillor Marnie, you have 5 minutes if you would like to start. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
I can, thank you.
Okay. My focus is actually on the actions of the planning department in all this, and also to very quickly run through the whole background to this for those of you who wouldn't be as aware of us of what's actually gone on. Eddie Williams today has just mentioned that he's learned something. Let me just go through the catalogue of this. The Vale of Glamorgan prepared a list of candidate sites, some 20 or 30. Substantial work was put into this. Sully was, the substantial report on the Sully site ended off with a sentence, this site is not suitable for a Gypsy and traveller site. The top of that list was the Llangarn site by the Vale, which we know can accommodate 18 fully set out, fully to standard suitable pitches, and they have been provided with a map of this put together by an expert on Gypsy sites. What actually happened then, the site at Hayes Road was occupied, and all of a sudden a new list was produced with the Sully site at the top. And a desktop, what was described as a desktop exercise was carried out to re-evaluate these sites, and all that they changed on the Sully evaluation was the last sentence was struck out, the bit that they'd already deemed that this site was not suitable for Gypsy and travel. They just done away with it. How can that possibly happen? It was pointed out that it was in a flood zone, not only the approach road, but the actual site, half of the site itself, which you've actually seen on the map tonight that's been put there. And I would point out that the red mapping that was on there actually extends down to the existing site. So that was pointed out by us, the amateurs. And that's the LDP hearing held by Richard Jenkins, the Welsh Assembly Planning Inspector, who threw this site out inside about 2 hours, and he addressed the senior members, one of whom is here tonight, the senior members of the planning department. His actual words were, how did this ever get off the planning board with this being in a flood zone. Now, our planning department had spent 4 years dealing with this, and it was thrown out on one thing that they'd been advised at by people such as myself, who are amateurs. How can that possibly happen without repercussions to those responsible for that? We then had a letter, and I had to laugh at Mike Ingram saying that there is no compromise in health and safety, after Mr. Richard Jenkins said that there can be no development residential at this area, especially for vulnerable communities. The Vale then sent a letter allowing them to stay there for 5 years, totally ignoring the Welsh Assembly Planning Inspector's advice and instruction. And now you're talking about care and duty and health and safety being non-negotiable. It's an absolute outrage. We then had a meeting, I think it was called, whatever the committee was called then, now called the Home and Safe Communities meeting, when on 4 occasions, senior Vale planning officers maintained that the bottom of the site was not in the flood zone. And it was only because myself and Bob Penrose were present and protested on 4 occasions that they would finally have to produce a map. And when they said they'd have to produce it, put their heads together, come in, oh, actually, it is in the flood zone. So there we have a whole committee, your predecessors, being misled on 4 occasions, only picked up by myself and Bob Penrose, because they refused to provide the map that you've seen tonight, which is quite clearly in there. We've now got the unbelievable situation. They're attempting to downgrade standards. They've been in touch with Welsh Government to downgrade standards. We've just spent £84 million upgrading all our council houses. Now, what would have been said if we'd have attempted to downgrade standards, set down standards for people living in housing? Yet you suggest that this community should live in substandard conditions. What on earth is going on? And I feel it's incumbent on this committee not only to reject this, but to call for an independent examination of the role of our planning committee, department, and their role in this. It's absolutely outstanding. We've mentioned tonight things aren't statutory, Mike Ingram again. Yet when things are statutory, they're ignoring them. Please, can I ask you as a committee to ask and instigate an independent inquiry to the entire saga stretching over 9 years involving the Vale of Glamorgan Planning Committee and its officers? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Marnie. Councillor Marnie, I think that was pretty much bang on 5 minutes, so thank you. I'm now going to go back to officers and any cabinet members that may wish to speak. I saw Victoria put her hand up before Councillor Marnie started speaking, so if Victoria would still like to speak, I'll go to her first.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I just wanted to address a couple of the points that were raised by Councillor Penrose. The issue of the settlement boundary, I think, was also raised by public speakers, and just to confirm that in planning policy terms, the consideration of Gypsy and traveller accommodation does have different planning policies to normal open market housing schemes. Hence, different planning policies apply. Similar to agricultural development, Gypsy and traveller use and residential use is an exception to normal planning policies, and therefore they do not necessarily need to be within settlement boundaries in the same way that open market housing does. So just to clarify on that point, really. I think there was reference to the proposed exploration in terms of the new access being potentially through land that would otherwise flood, or land that would necessitate access out through the private ABP roads. As I showed on the map earlier when I was explaining where the site is and what land we were talking about to the east of the current tolerated site, that doesn't flood, as was shown on that plan, and we were talking about exploring the potential to open up access to the east, to the adopted highway, none of which floods, and which would not be relying on access then out via the private ABP land. So I just wanted to clarify that point. I think it's not quite fair to say that attempts have been half-hearted in any way to in terms of exploring opportunities in both council-owned land, private land, and so on, and we will continue to do so. You know, this report is, as we've said several times, the recommendations are clear. It is not saying this site is taken forward as the final site. What it's saying is let's explore whether or not there are any potentials to address some of the constraints that have been referred to, because we have so far been unable to identify an appropriate suitable site elsewhere, whether that's council land, private land, or potentially compulsory purchasing land. And all the other issues that have been raised would need exploration through that process, through the planning process, through the site investigation works. A number of the constraints that have been flagged up regarding that. The issue of downgrading standards, I think Mike will probably want to say a bit more on that, but just to be clear, we're not talking about downgrading standards. What we're saying is that the current Welsh Government guidance, by their own admission, focuses very largely on a particular set and community of Gypsy travellers and does not necessarily take account of the needs, desires and wants of all of the Gypsy and traveller community. In particular, the residents that we are talking about here, the current occupiers at Hayes Road, who we have, through discussions with both them and Welsh Government, identified that actually the standards set out in the Welsh Government guidance don't reflect their community's needs and wants in terms of formal site layout and provision, something Welsh Government officials have openly acknowledged and accepted with us. Hence the need for a discussion about Welsh Government guidance reflecting the whole community and not just one part of the Gypsy and traveller community, that the grant availability reflects those flexible wants and needs and requirements. And that is, you know, the right and proper thing to do. And it's in no way inferring that the standards would be substandard or downgraded. It's just responding to the needs and wants of the community that we're talking about. So just thought it was worth clarifying that point as well. But I can see Marcus has got his hand up, so I'll also hand over to him. Thanks.
Thank you, Victoria. Marcus, if you would like to come in, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, thank you. Just a couple of other issues. Vicky's dealt with most of the issues. I don't want to go back and dwell over old ground in terms of the previous history to this, but it was raised that the council dealt with the allocation of the site incorrectly when the LDP was being considered. And I think one of the key things for members to be aware of is that when that site was put forward, it was put forward following a very extensive process of engaging with statutory consultees around the suitability of the site or otherwise, and that included with Natural Resources Wales, who are Welsh Government's advisor on flood issues, who actually did not raise objections, supported the allocation and came forward with and accepted a scheme which would have been for the evacuation of the site should flooding occur. Unfortunately, the inspector, which is his prerogative, did decide he did not like that site within the LDP in that form. He did not make, as was suggested, a categoric statement that it should never be included and would, on the back of that, should never come forward as a planning application. That's not what his powers were to do. He was only considering a local development plan, and he felt the site shouldn't be included. So I just wanted to make it clear that site hadn't just been thrown in on a whim. It had gone through a long process, and indeed it had consultations with Natural Resources Wales, who are Welsh Government's advisors in respect of flooding. One other key issue, I think, which is important, is that we need to be very clear that we're not talking about just the front part of the site. I think there's been quite a lot of discussion about how much of that site is covered by flood risk, and indeed part of it is in the outer zone of the Health and Safety Executive's zone of concern. It's in the green zone, which actually doesn't prevent development and doesn't necessarily prevent housing either, but actually that line only crosses approximately a similar line to the flood zone at the front of the site. But the important point is that the site that we're talking about is a wider site, stretching down almost as far as the car park at the bottom end, and outside of the flood zone, and indeed outside of any Health and Safety Executive identified zone in that particular respect. So just wanted to make that point clear as well. I think that's it. So thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. That was very educational. I certainly learned some things there. If I was just going to ask, are there any other officers? And Mike has put his hands up, so go ahead, Mike. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. It's just to cover off a couple of other points that were mentioned. It's not about downgrading standards. In discussions with Welsh Government officials, they acknowledged that the standards, the design standards that were adopted as guidance in 2015, didn't adequately take account of the traveller community. And as a result of which, there was a commitment that they would look to review their guidance. So it isn't about reducing standards as has been suggested. What it is working with the community to design sites which they would wish to live in, but equally, as I say, ensure that the minimum standards that we would all expect are met. So that's really the first point. Councillor Penrose mentioned the boys' camp at East Aberthaw. Now, I'm not aware that we have had, through the call for candidate sites or the contact with land and managing agents, I'm not aware that we have had an indication from the landowners there with regard to the use of this site specifically, but perhaps Vicky can comment further on that.
Sorry, yes, Mike, I did want to address that. I'm glad you remembered that. I did actually take a phone call about a week ago, which is the first time that I've been in contact with anybody or had any approach from any private landowners. And it was somebody with an interest potentially in that site. And I was very open about this report coming forward and the processes that we have gone through and that we will go through, and open about offering any exploration of any further sites that were to come forward. So I left it with that individual that if they did procure an interest in that site, that they should contact us to discuss any options about potential sites. And we would continue to do that going forward with any sites that come forward, you know, as part of this process until such time as a final site is chosen and the Cabinet make a decision on that, which, you know, I've been very clear is not what today's meeting is about or the Cabinet resolution is about. So yes, we've had that one approach directly to myself, but only a week or so ago. So if Councillor Penrose or anyone else is aware of any other land or allocations, by all means pass those details on and we can continue to explore those options, because you know, that's what we're here to do.
Thank you, Victoria. Councillor Wilkinson would like to come back in.
Thank you, Chair. Like I said earlier on, this is not a done deal. Now, if there is other people coming forward with pieces of land, or anybody knows of anybody, we will listen, and definitely I will listen. So please, what I said earlier on is I am not saying any more, except this is not a done deal. We are listening to what people is telling us and saying. Thank you.
Okay, now if there are no other officers or Cabinet members that would like to speak, I'd like to open this up to the rest of the committee. Who would like to speak first?
Chair, I think Mrs. Smith is raising her hand.
Oh, okay, sorry, I don't seem to have you on my screen, Mrs. Smith, so I couldn't see. And I think Julie wanted to have a chat and then wanted to come in, and then it will be Sandra. So if you'd like to go, Mr. Smith. You're on mute. You need to unmute yourself.
Maybe she doesn't know how to do it. Maybe somebody could explain.
Are we able?
Yeah, sorry, Mrs. Smith. There's a microphone icon on your screen. If you click on that, that should unmute you. Unfortunately, Mrs. Smith, I can't unmute you from my end. For some reason, it's not coming up. Bear with me a second.
Yeah. Mrs. Smith, if you look at the top of your screen, you'll see the options, and there's a big red button that says leave. About 2 across from there, you'll see the microphone. If you click on that, it should unmute you.
Is that unmuted you?
Yes, it has.
Hello.
Thank you, Smith.
Hello, I'm back. Right. Just one thing I'd like to bring up, and I'm not quite so sure about, is a lot of, is it compulsory order? How do you go about that and obtain that then? Is it an order you can go in and make and demand, or is there other requirements? That's what I'm trying to say. I don't understand it.
Okay, would somebody like to explain that?
Chair, Chair, very quickly. Compulsory purchase. Thank you. Compulsory purchase order is basically a power that's available to a council as a statutory undertaker to force the purchase of land if the landowner is unwilling to sell for a purpose which has been identified as being a statutory purpose managed by the council. So in this particular case, the provision of a Gypsy and Traveller site. So it is a power to purchase land. In a good example would be we have used these powers to purchase land to provide a road or to provide other facilities associated with transport as well. So it's a power that we have just to obtain land if we need that land.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Aviat, I believe you're next.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. I was just wondering that if the scheme goes ahead and we have a new access road, would there still be enough room for their allotments, for people who wanted the allotments?
I think from recollection, the allotment proposal was part of the actual site that we would here be looking to use for the Gypsy use. I think it was on part of the land hatched green on that plan that I showed you earlier. So, I don't think the two things could be accommodated. I think it's likely that we would need to use the entire site to meet the Gypsy and Traveller need, and that they wouldn't probably be compatible with also having allotment provision. So obviously, it's perhaps not for officers that are here necessarily to comment on what the council as landowner in this case chooses to do with its land in terms of whether it's to meet this provision, its statutory requirement to meet Gypsy and Traveller need, or whether it's to facilitate a community council scheme for an allotment proposal. Obviously, the speakers have alluded to the fact that there was some support for that project a number of years ago, when it was hoped that an alternative site for the Gypsy and Travellers would be able to be found to enable them to move off the site and potentially for the site to be used for allotments. So hence why that issue is being explored. But sorry, in simple answer to your question, I don't think the two things could happen. I think it would have to be a choice between one or the other. Again, a choice to be made down the line.
Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. Thank you, Councillor Aviat. Councillor Perks, you are next in line to speak.
Thank you, Chair. I just wondered if any of the officers know how many other councils are having difficulty in Wales in actually supplying a permanent Gypsy and Traveller site, and whether it's a running theme of issues that people have. Obviously, ours is flooding, but also what the councils that have provided a permanent site, is there anything that they've managed to do to ensure that this happens, that we perhaps missing out on, or is it just bad luck on our part?
Chair, perhaps I could.
Yes, go ahead, Mike. Sorry, I was trying to press unmute and it wouldn't let me.
Just as an aside, across Wales, the local authorities are required to partake in what are called caravan counts. So the last caravan count that I'm aware of was 2020, and at that time there were approximately just over 1,000 caravans on 136 sites across Wales. Most of those, or the proportion of those, were on authorised sites, and there's a proportion obviously on unauthorised sites. So I don't think the position in the Vale is any different necessarily than other parts or areas of Wales. I understand from the caravan count there are just over 400 caravans sited on local authority provided sites. So, you know, there's a substantial number of local authorities that are currently providing, and other local authorities during the period that we've been discussing with Welsh Government have been able to draw down the capital grant and to deliver sites in their area. So I think that's what I can say, is that it's not unique. The issues that we're discussing in terms of land and availability of land, and those practical aspects are common across various other areas of Wales. But as I say, in terms of the numbers of gypsies and travellers that have been counted as part of the last caravan count, is about 1,000 across Wales.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Is it all right if I just ask another quick question, Chair?
Marcus wants to come in as well. I believe he might.
Okay. Oh, sorry, Marcus.
Marcus, do you want to respond to this, or would you like Councillor Perks to ask a next question and then maybe?
Thank you, Chair. Really quickly, because I really was just going to echo what Mike said, but from the planning side of it, really, which is that, as Mike has said, there are quite a number of sites across Wales. Recently, it is becoming harder, I have to say, for councils to deliver new sites. So there are a number of established sites across South Wales and in the Cardiff capital region as well. But it is, you know, it's on record as a planning record, matter of fact, that it is quite difficult now to gain planning permission beyond if you like, the sites that already exist. So I think it's fair to say that the difficulty, councils are finding it difficult to progress sites. It's not just an issue that is, if you like, solely applicable to the Vale of Glamorgan. We are aware of neighbouring authorities where there is demand and there aren't sites, and they are finding it equally difficult to progress sites.
Thank you.
Okay, Sandra, if you would like to ask your next question.
Yes, I don't know whether I missed this in the report or not, but I just wondered whether we're actually time bound to actually provide permanent sites, whether there's Welsh Government have said that, you know, local authorities need to provide a gypsy and traveller site by a certain time period.
Okay, Marcus, I can see you've got your hand up. Would you like to come in on this?
Thank you, Chair. Probably Mike will answer a few other bits of this as well. But firstly, there's the gypsy and traveller site assessment process, which Mike has gone through in some detail at the start of the report. And obviously, in normal circumstances, we'd be expected to deliver site requirements as set out in that during the time or during the life of that assessment. That being said, it is recognised that it's not always that easy. We also have the requirements that are set out by the local development plan, which when it was adopted, obviously it was adopted with the small Llangan site in, but a reference to a site selection process to find an alternative site for the additional sites that hadn't been identified. So that plan is now entering this year, will be entering its first review. That will take some years. There's not a specific deadline at the end of that, but the plan itself obviously runs till 2026, and the review will have to happen before that time. So I think it's fair to say that there are two sorts of deadlines, if you like. There's the gypsy and traveller sites assessment, which provides some sort of indication of timings, and then you have the life of the LDP as well.
Thank you, Marcus.
Sorry, Chair, just to add to that point, we clearly are continuing to be in discussion with Welsh Government in relation to delivery of a site. I go back to the point that the council is statutorily required to deliver a site now that we've identified that need. Welsh Government are content with the progress of the council in investigating and attempting to deliver the need. So there is no compulsion at this stage from Welsh Government with regard to a deadline. They are satisfied that the work that we've been doing over the last couple of years, accepting that it is extremely difficult to deliver a site, that the work that we're doing it is actually moving towards that goal.
Okay, thank you. I think it is next. It is Councillor Hans, and then we have Councillor Cave. So if you would like to come in on this, Councillor Hanks.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to explore the Llangan site. I think it's my understanding that there are 2 dwellings, but potentially there could be 18 dwellings. Would I be right, and can we explore that avenue at all? Thank you, Chair.
Okay, who would like to come back on that? Anybody?
Sorry, Chair. I want, as the member for Llangan, I wonder if I could quickly help people have an understanding of the site there. Particularly, the site is opposite to the site that we've been discussing in Surrey this evening, in that it's only the front of the site which is usable, and the site actually slopes away and forms part of a marshland. So I think it's a big misunderstanding on the part of Councillor Marnie and others that may have suggested that this site could be facilitate 18 pitches. And had that been the case, I'm sure our officers would have explored that way before now. I don't know whether that's been helpful to anybody to answering it in that way, but it really it has already has 2 families on there, and it is full with those 2 families because the rest of the land cannot be used.
Okay, thank you, Councillor. Marcus is wanting to come in. Can I just quickly ask, Councillor Cave, once Marcus has come back on this response, are you looking to ask another question?
Yes, I am.
Okay, I will keep that in mind. Okay, go ahead, Marcus. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm not sure whether Mike might want to come back as well on this, but just
maybe.
Really to reiterate actually what Councillor Cave has said is that when this site was looked at as part of the LDP process, it is relevant that the site is sloping, quite sloping, steeply sloping once you get beyond the flat area where the current families are located, and it would involve considerable engineering works to do anything with it, and actually there's no guarantee that you would achieve that in terms of getting the site. So while it may look on paper as if it's a large site, it does have difficulties in terms of its layout and the condition of the land. It's also worth noting that, as pointed out, there are existing families on that site, and we have to take account of that and the difficulties that might be incurred if in trying to impose additional residents there. So all those factors were considered as part of the process when we did look at the site allocation. And ultimately, it is recognised in the LDP, but only for a maximum of 2 families or 2 caravans, for example.
Thank you, Marcus. Are you looking to come in as well, Mike?
Yes, thank you, Chair. It's my understanding, and it's some years ago when Llangan site was being considered. It didn't, from memory, accommodate based on Welsh Government specification. It didn't accommodate adequate numbers, but more importantly, best practice and best advice is that you wouldn't necessarily mix 2 cultures or 2 communities. And in this instance, clearly you have a traveller community in Sully, and obviously a Gypsy community on the site in Llangan. to my understanding, they're clearly, from their perspectives, they're relevant perspectives, and you would take into account their needs and wishes in considering the suitability of a site. My understanding is that it wouldn't be a suitable site in order to mix a variety of communities on the one site.
Okay, thank you. Marcus, you still have your hand up. Are you looking to say anything more? Okay. Councillor Cave, I believe you're next.
Oh, thank you, Chair. As committee may well recognise, I've been calling for this particular report to come to committee and to cabinet for some considerable time now. So I'm slightly relieved that we actually have the opportunity to discuss the report and see the report this evening. And I thank cabinet for passing it over to us. There has been a lot of discussion this evening about sites. And yes, we have been through lots of consultations, lots of calls for land. And, you know, I have no doubt that this has not been a rushed process and that it's been a very considered process. But I would like to suggest that what's actually missing from the meeting this evening is the voice of the Gypsy travellers. And, you know, we're all talking about sites, and actually what we're really talking about is people's lives. And the community that already exists in Sully, that they are people that have families and children that go to school close by. And I would like, if possible, for Mike to give us an understanding of what those families' wishes are.
Thank you, Councillor Cave. Chair, I can confirm that, you know, a number of officers have met with the traveller community at Sully. I think it's fair to say that they have ambitions and aspirations for the future that they feel that they can't progress with at this stage because they have no settled accommodation provision as such. There currently aren't, as far as I'm aware, any children on site, but what was expressed to us by some of the travellers at the meetings that we had, that part of that was down to this uncertainty, the uncertainty of not knowing if they'll be at this site or another site or on any site in the future. So I think it's very relevant, the point that's been made in terms of the wishes of the travellers. The travellers, as far as I'm aware, and again through discussions, and we have to be careful that, you know, then again, as I mentioned at the outset, they're not a conglomerate as such. They are in, you know, the people who are living on that site are individuals, and they have their own individual needs and wants. So we have to be mindful of that as well. But I mean, in terms of, you're quite right, you know, they have been on and part of the Sully community for the last 10 years or so. Clearly they will have support networks in place, whether that be doctors or facilities within Sully and the wider community. And clearly, you know, they have been resident there for quite some time, in the same way as you know, we support our other residents within the Vale of Glamorgan. You know, with my other hat on, looking at affordable housing delivery, we're required to assess the needs of our local community, and we look to deliver accommodation appropriate to those needs. And I don't think they're expecting any more or less of us as a local authority in terms of providing for their futures.
Thank you, Mike. I believe Councillor Parker is next to speak. If you would like to come in, please.
Yes, thank you, Chair. It might be helpful to the committee if the officers went back to the original Assembly report where they established the numbers, because I have a feeling that that's actually under review at the moment, and it could be that the numbers that they projected then could diminish.
Councillor Parker, you've muted yourself.
Sorry, I was trying to make sure I could. There we are. How far did I get? I was saying it might be helpful if the officers could go back to help the committee with the original report that came out from the Assembly seven years ago or whatever. Thank you.
Okay, Marcus, I believe you want to come back on that.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, well, obviously we're working to the Gypsy and Traveller site assessment, which was undertaken in 2016, which is prior to the LDP being adopted. That figure which we're working to won't change until a new site assessment is undertaken, which Mike referred to in the preamble to the report. That's likely to be next year at the earliest now, which would could identify a different set of numbers. It'll be up to that assessment to go through that process. But we are currently still working to the figures that were identified at that time.
Fine. Thank you, Marcus.
Sorry, Chair, can I just
thank you very much, Marcus.
A supplemental just to that, just to say we do undertake annual counts and we do liaise with the travellers on the site, and our understanding is that the numbers that we saw in the last Gypsy and Traveller Accommodation Assessment, if anything, they may have slightly grown on the site. The site is fluid, as you'd expect. They're travellers and they do come and go and they have seasonal jobs and so on. But our understanding, when we have liaised with them and discussed with them the numbers on the site, they've confirmed that what the 18 pictures that we've been talking about and looking for, that those figures sound about right to them. So, you know, we've got no reason to expect those numbers to significantly drop or significantly increase when we do our next Gypsy and Traveller Accommodation Assessment, which will be within the next 12 months.
Thank you, Victoria. Councillor Moore is the next to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I didn't intend to speak tonight, but I'm really pleased the discussion that's gone on so far, but I would like to bring committee back to the report. And I'd like to reiterate the point that Councillor Margaret Wilkinson made, is that this report sets out a way forward for the Council to address the identified long-term need of Gypsy and Travellers. And what I would like to do is to actually then refer you to other items in the report which seems to have been missed really. It's clear in paragraph 225 that the inspector says it became clear through the examination that part of Hayes Road site, including the only access to and from the site, is located in the zone C2 floodplain. And I think the issue there is the only. If you go to 226, it just highlights the point that it's clear the inspector's concerns was that the access to the site should not be affected by the flooding, and is currently the case in Hayes Road site. If you then go to paragraph 228, and I think this is the crux of the report really, is however it says there may be alternative means of emergency vehicular access via the adjacent land that is not affected by the flooding to connect to the adopted highway on South Road, as Vicky showed in her plans, which is also not within the flood zone. If you then look at 229, it talks about the site extends south, and it talks about the fact that it extends south to the coast, to the coastal path and the public right of way, and this was proposed as an emergency means of escape in the flood plan when the site was adopted in the draft LDP. This was not considered to be appropriate by the inspector, but it's clear that the site would need a safer access in case of emergencies during a flooding event, for example, police, fire, rescue, etc. Therefore, the purpose of this is to consider whether or not an alternative means, a safe means of access, can be identified and delivered if it offers that opportunity to meet the identified need for the accommodation on the land not affected by flooding. And as such, that solution would address the LDP's inspectors' concerns set out above and comply with the planning policy. So simply, it may be possible to provide suitable access from land to the east of the site. And I think that is the purpose of the report more than anything else. there's been a lot of discussion about what's happened and how you've looked for various parcels of land, and that's been made quite clear by the officers, because clearly there's been a vast amount of work carried out on there. And they have, yes, come back to this particular parcel of land. And this is just one of the reasons why it's brought here, because it could be a means of addressing the need. And I think that's the purpose of the report. This report sets out it is a possibility, and therefore that's why Cabinet thought it was a reasonable thing to bring forward. I didn't intend to speak, but the problem was that nobody has addressed the report as it is written and as was addressed by Cabinet. And I just wanted to highlight that to Scrutiny. But I have to say, it's been a good discussion, and thank you for chairing it the way you have.
Thank you very much, Councillor. I appreciate that. Councillor Parker, you still have your hand up, so I'm assuming you have another question. Also, we will go then after Councillor Parker, we'll go to Councillor Penrose after any officers have come back to Councillor Parker's question.
Yeah, no, apologies, Chair, that's me not being up to date. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. If you could lower your hand then, please, Councillor, thank you. Okay, Councillor Penrose, if you would like to speak.
Thank you, Chair, for affording me the opportunity to come back. There's only one point, and the leader touched on it, in investigating this alternative route. The route discussed and shown by planning in the proposal would follow the perimeter of the Beechwood College for Autism. Now, locals will tell you, and you don't have to take my word, that perimeter fence has signposts all the way along advising people not to walk close to the fence, not to walk dogs close to the fence, because the students get upset. And yet we're proposing a roadway alongside that perimeter fence with access to a traveller's site. Just raising that point, and I think it's quite relevant. At the moment, it's open space, it's agricultural field, but I think that would very much put up a strong objection from Beechwood College.
Okay, thank you. I can see Victoria has her hand up.
Thank you, Chair. I'm sorry if the way in which I've presented the information has led you to that conclusion, but there is no line on a plan or proposals for where precisely this road would go, whether it would be immediately adjacent to Beechwood College or anything else. You know, there's nothing in the report that suggests that, and I'm sorry if the way I presented the plan suggested that. What the report is saying is actually the existing vehicular access floods. That was the reason the appeal inspector said it wasn't sound for inclusion in the LDP. That's the major constraint that we need to investigate, whether there are other alternatives, and that could include land to the east, and it need not necessarily immediately hug the Beechwood College proposal. All of those things need investigation. You know, that's why you need to carry out site investigations. You need to have a design a road of an appropriate form. None of that has been done. None of that has been looked at. That was the purpose of the Cabinet report, to sort of start that process and consider those things. So all of that would have to sort of be considered and thought about in consultation with the college as well as anyone else affected by the proposals.
Thank you for that, Victoria. Sandra, you were the next person to put your hand up. So if you would like to come in, we will then have officers come back to you. Then we'll go back to Councillor Parker and then Councillor Marnie.
I was just going to say, after picking up on what Councillor Moore had to say, that obviously, yes, in the report it does talk about it being an emergency access road, which therefore means it's going to be used infrequently. I don't actually see what the harm is in investigating the possibility of this actually being a possibility, you know, that an emergency access road for this site being a possibility of that being looked into. And also it said it's not the site, it's a possibility of a site, but with other, sort of places in the Vale perhaps becoming available, or discussions with Victoria Robinson and stuff like that might happen. I think it's worth having a look into this just to see what the feasibility is.
Thank you, Sandra. If any officers want to come back, please do so. If not, I'll go on to Andrew Parker. Thank you, Councillor Parker. It's going to be you next, then Councillor Marnie.
Thank you, Chair. I was just going to comment that quite clearly the cost of an access on the one that's been discussed would totally prohibit, with the amount of money allowed by the Assembly for any site, you couldn't actually construct that road. But picking up on the point, it would be a good idea to just investigate it, work out a likely cost, and I think that would resolve the problem.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Marnie, and can I please remind councillors and anybody else, so if you are not speaking, please can you lower your hand? Thank you. Councillor Marnie, you can come in now if you wish.
Okay, thank you. I've got a few points that have been risen here that I feel need answering. Number one has already been pointed out. In Beechwood College, Wales is only, I understand, college for autistic students. There's strong objections to the if a large site was put there that would disrupt their students, all the valuable work that's done there. There's that for a start. We then have, of course, the fact if an access road was built, and cost has just been mentioned here, which would be just staggering, it would then wreck Beechwood College land to the south, and also, as already been said, the Welsh Church Estates Act field as well. So you're wrecking two sites there as well by putting a road straight through it. You've also taken away, and I think Victoria Robinson kind of boxed around it a bit, although she did eventually say, actually the site is the exact site allotment, not it may affect the allotment. And so I think she did qualify that by saying that not both projects can go ahead. You're taking allotments that was promised, the land for allotments promised to an existing community before these travellers ever turned up, ripping it out of their grasp basically by people who've turned up after the event. Stopping allotments, which has been explained, is a statutory duty to provide by Surrey Community Council for a start. The other thing is, of course, it's not just the access road, as has already been explained. It's the bottom part of the site will still be in the flood zone, as you see it on your maps. I've got two very other quick points to make. Number one, we have been told time and time again, it indicated that the current residents aren't prepared to go on a regulated site. Have they now withdrawn this? Because that would mean, if they're on a regulated site, that would mean surely a reluctance to pay to be on a regulated site. I haven't read anywhere that they've withdrawn that, so maybe the officers can clarify that. And my last point is this. You've heard mention here of Welsh Government this, Welsh Government that, they've approved this, they approved that. And they're calling for this Scrutiny Committee to call for an independent investigation the entire actions of the Vale Planning Department over this whole sorry affair. I am reminded of the Vale of Glamorgan issuing a statement at the time of the 2016 hearing that Welsh Government were in favour of the proposals put forward by the Vale for this site. I knew that not to be true, as I'd seen the letter from Welsh Government and it didn't say anything of the sort. I actually took the trouble to contact and track down the people who had sent that paper within the offices within Welsh Government. They were absolutely furious that they had been misrepresented. And in fact, two of them turned up at the LDP hearing, where not only were our planning officers, I think there were 6 or 7 of them in attendance, absolutely torn to shreds verbally by the planning inspector, but also attacked basically verbally again, I should point out, by the two representatives of the Welsh Government who said they had been misrepresented and they backed up exactly what the planning inspector. Can I please ask you to make your point? My point is, we're having stuff presented here that, quite frankly, my faith in anything that comes out of the planning department severely dented, and surely all this must be covered by an independent investigation. And that's what I'm asking the Scrutiny to ask for. I've never seen such a shambolic affair over this 9 years, and I feel it's just appalling that they're carrying on like this. And surely, who can possibly say it would be a bad thing to have an independent investigation into their actions? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor. Are there any officers that would like to come back on that? Okay.
Councillor Collins, sorry, Chair, just really quickly, on one or two points. Obviously, one thing just to say that we heard reference to wrecking of the land, and I think we just have to refer back to the point that this is just an exploration and we haven't put forward any actual proposals around an access or anything else, and therefore that would form part of any investigating procedure. I think there was reference to the allotments that have been promised, and I think actually that's a little bit untrue. It's not necessarily the case that they've been promised, but I think that's not a matter that we are considering at the moment. We're considering the exploration of the potential of this as one of a number of sites. And finally, I think I don't want to dwell on the issue of the LDP inspector's report. We've been over this many times, just to say that our recollection of what happened is completely different to Councillor Barney's recollection. So I think that's the best thing we can say there.
Okay, thank you very much, Marcus. I am just going to ask now, are there any more members of this committee who would like to speak? If not, then go ahead, Councillor Brooks.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I say apologies for missing part of the discussion earlier, but I do feel that there aren't any firm proposals on the table at this present time. So I do think that, you know, it's been a long and fruitful discussion and a very useful one, but I do think that we actually either need to make some recommendations to go back to Cabinet now, or are we just going to propose that our views and our thoughts and that discussion is passed back to Cabinet for information? I just think maybe it needs to be sort of brought in a little bit, and actually, you know, just refer back what we need to refer back to Cabinet for further exploration, as far as I'm concerned, because there are no firm proposals within this report here tonight. It's a very useful report, and I'm actually glad to have this update. But there's still a long way to go and still lots more work to do as well.
Thank you, Councillor Brooks. Councillor Parker, you are going to be the last person to speak on this item, as we have been on this item now for nearly 2 hours, and we do have more on the agenda. So if you would like to come back in, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And this is for Mike. The cost of providing the original site at Hayes Road was in excess of 2.3 million. The rents that had to be collected were £80 to £90 a week. And should the thing not be successful, I think we actually might have had to pay the money back. I'm not sure whether I've actually remembered everything, but Michael might be able to help.
Okay, Mike, you want to come in on that? And I will be then drawing a line under this.
I think your figures are what I recall as well from that period. In terms of the discussion we've had this evening, clearly it's very difficult for us to have a conversation with the travellers about a particular site when we don't have a site to discuss. And in terms of how that might be laid out and what facilities might be on the site and what the costs and all these other things would be, it's impossible to have a meaningful conversation with the traveller community about that at this stage. So I would just refer back to the comments that have been made. There will be an appropriate time where we will sit down with the travellers on this or any other site that potentially does come forward as the chosen and preferred option and can be delivered.
Okay, thank you. So we have now reached the end of that item. I will just confirm that all comments made tonight will be referred back to Cabinet in the form of the minutes from this meeting. Okay. I am now going to suggest we take a 5 to 10 minute comfort break. So go make a cuppa, go do what you need to do, and then we shall see you in about 5 to 10 minutes. Thank you.
Just a very quick one.
Yeah.
In terms of recommendation about comments, what I'll do is obviously put in the recommendation just a summary of the comments that have been listed by the various parties, and then that will obviously go back to Cabinet for consideration if there are no other recommendations. Okay, what I
meant to phrase it like that, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine, Chair. What I'll also say is I will pause recording while we adjourn and then restart once we're back on, okay?
Okay, thank you.
Oh, bear with me a second. Yeah, his recording is now started, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Brooks.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'm a little unclear from the last item what recommendations we've actually sent back to Cabinet. Is the recommendation that we actually to carry out further investigations after we've considered the report? I'm a bit unclear what we've actually recommended back.
Who's best to answer that? I haven't got it all written down.
Well, with all respect, Chair, it should come from the committee, not officers' recommendations.
Okay, but I haven't written it all down, so I'm just asking for a bit of clarification from the officer, as of what the actual. I haven't written them all down, you see.
Bear with me, Chair. Obviously, the one for us was that this has come back from Cabinet, and any comments that were raised from the meeting will be sent back to Cabinet to be considered for further review. But as said, if there are any further recommendations that members wish to make, we can by all means look at that. Councillor Brooks, was there anything you had in particularly in mind in terms of recommendation, other than taking back comments that have been raised at the meeting?
Well, I just think it's a case that maybe, we should endorse that Cabinet further investigates any potential sites, particularly as it does appear somebody else has come forward, but obviously that was only just before this meeting. So to give them that option to actually go out and explore all options of further investigations, one around the access, and then also about any other potential sites as well. So I just think we need maybe to firm that up. Because I'm not sure if everybody's even agreed all the comments that were made here this evening.
Okay, Councillor Brooks, I have no problem with that being added into the recommendations, and I can see Julie Aviat is also agreeing on that. Does anybody else have any objections to that?
No, don't have any objections to that. I think Councillor Parker and myself both said within the comments that we felt that it should go ahead just to investigate the emergency access road. So yes, we have said that as well.
Yes, I have got a note of that, and that has been put in with all the comments that will be going back.
Yeah. Yes. Chair, if I might just get some clarification. We are still actively, as far as I know, investigating sites. Clearly, from what Marcus was saying, in 12 months' time, we might have a review. So the important thing is to keep everything open and flexible, respecting everything that's been said tonight, but moving forward to try and re-establish whether there are any further sites. And I know it's been very difficult, but that's what the recommendation, I believe, should incorporate.
Okay, thank you. As it is a reference from Cabinet, I don't believe we have any obligation to offer up any recommendations, but I will happily do so and bring those in. Thank you.
That'll be included in the minutes as well, Chair, and those recommendations will go back then for Cabinet for consideration.
Okay, thank you.
If everyone is happy now, if the committee is happy with that.
I am. Okay, I saw Councillor Hanks had her hand up. Are you still wanting to speak?
No, well, I was just going to add, Chair, that I was happy to approve the recommendations 1 to 5. I think point 5 clarifies what we were wanting to do, further investigations. So I'm happy to endorse those recommendations. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we're going to go on to agenda item number 5, which is the update on the dark service, and I believe Benny will be taking the lead on this. So if you would like to come in on this, please.
Thank you, Chair. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. My name is Benny Lepine. I'm the Policy Manager and Development Manager for the Community Safety team. So I've had various amounts of involvement with the dark service since its implementation. So just in way of background, I know that this committee approved the implementation of the dark, so there won't be a need for too much background. You've had various updates as well, but just in way of a refresher, the Domestic Abuse Assessment and Referral Coordination process, so the DARC, went live in June of 2018. It works in partnership with South Wales Police to receive all standard and medium domestic abuse PPNs, And then the coordinator works with other departments in the council, notably community safety and children's services, adult services and education, as well as the police, probation and third sector, to investigate really the bigger picture behind a victim's involvement with services and their current them and their families' needs, in order to create a more tailored support plan to be developed for the victim and their family. And critically, the victim is contacted as well, so they're really on board and involved in their own support referral pathway, their own package from the very beginning. So the services really has done a good job in kind of stopping the blanket referring that was happening beforehand, and a lot of the duplication of referrals that was happening before, and it really has focused on providing the right service at the right time. This innovation was recognised a couple of times in 2019, and most notably it won the Vale Annual Staff Awards under the Project of Most Innovative Project category. The service has done an awful lot in way of developing better data collection methods. And this has been critical actually in developing the team's ability to focus campaigns in the right area and to work on what the needs are in relation to domestic abuse across the Vale and to respond to that effectively. Moving into the key kind of issues for consideration, across the first 3 quarters of 2020-2021, there were 1,016 PPNs received, and since the writing of this report, we've had the year-end figures, which show that the team processed 1,204 PPNs, domestic abuse PPNs. In terms of like-for-like referrals, it compares with roughly about 1,520 PPNs received last year. So there has been a reduction. There's been a much greater number of public level engagement and initiatives and kind of public engagement initiatives, particularly since the beginning of lockdown, where helplines, national helplines like Live Fear Free have been really promoted, and Atalifro have done a lot to promote the third sector provider have done a lot to promote their online support packages and services as well. So this might have something to do, it's kind of hoped that this might have promoted some earlier victim involvement directly with services, which will have driven down the need for a police call out. But having said that, the reduction in PPNs received by the DARC is actually much more likely to be as a result of a current issue that we're working on at the moment with South Wales Police regarding the sharing of PPNs without consent. So just, I mean, I suppose as a before note, the whole issue of consent with the police is one that's being looked at a force-wide level anyway. It's acknowledged that police officers attending an incident and asking for consent at that point is actually a bit of a contentious issue, and it might not be a reliable or fair way for victims to firstly understand what it means to give their consent, and also to have the unlocking of essentially the services that they can then access afterwards. So that's something that's being looked at as an aside. However, our local issue is that since the BCU merger, the DARC team now receives its PPNs via a different risk assessing team who run different processes, and they have looked at the ways and the agreed ways in which we store, collect data, and essentially I think what this has boiled down to is a difference in opinion around how that information should be shared and how that information should be stored and what information should be stored. So we're working through these issues at the moment, and I have to say it has been a bit frustrating, but it's really important that we have everybody on board and that we work well with the police in resolving these issues, just so that we iron everything out and we have a really airtight process for the future, so that we don't have these hurdles again. So as it currently stands, the dark coordinator used to store all of their information on a shared drive, and what we're currently working towards is for the dark coordinator to have permission and full access to Niche, which is the police information database, their information system. And they would then be updating, the coordinator would then be updating directly onto police service, the police systems, rather than having to uplift information from police systems and store them onto a different shared drive, which has been causing some of the nervousness around GDPR and around data protection and information sharing. So otherwise, PPNs haven't changed an awful lot in terms of their kind of risk ratings or their quantities, or indeed their demographics of where they've been. It's important to note that a decline or a reduction in PPNs isn't necessarily the only thing that's seen as kind of a positive outcome of a service like this. That actually there's been a lot of public engagement, there's been a lot of work around encouraging victims to call police and to get in touch when support's needed, and a lot of work done with police on better identification of domestic abuse when it's happening during an incident. So what we're actually expecting to see is the increase in domestic abuse incidents that have been seen in the Vale and across the rest of Wales and the UK as well. The team monitor repeat referrals, and we have been looking at whether or not repeat referrals coming down is an indicator of, or positive indicator of the service. But actually linked to this, and probably much more relevant, the team have been working to improve the mechanisms within which they receive feedback from the agencies to whom they refer. So really to get a better idea of whether or not those referrals are landing, whether victims are engaging. And we really see that as a much more likely indicator that the service is doing what it should be doing, and that it's providing the right level of service to victims and their families. The domestic abuse teams in community safety that made provisions, safeguarding provisions for what was expected to be a huge increase as a result of COVID, as a result of the global pandemic. Meetings were set up, particularly around providing additional refuge accommodation for victims and their families, and certainly around encouraging or increasing campaigns to promote online services and other ways in which victims could continue to get support. There was a lot of concern around the fact that victims would essentially be locked in with their perpetrators, and all of the other issues that would go alongside some of the difficulties with the anxieties and the other issues that were related to the pandemic. To date, reassuringly, I'd say COVID-19 hasn't actually had a large impact on the figures for standard and medium PPNs at all, and they have really remained relatively consistent with the previous year. The team have also looked specifically at whether or not COVID-19 was directly related to the incident. So where COVID-19 was an issue relating to COVID-19 was specifically mentioned within an instance and an incident, and also that's another that also hasn't shown to have had much of an effect. I think in the last couple of months, maybe one or two incidents, COVID-19 or something relating to COVID-19 was mentioned, but apart from that, the referrals have remained more or less consistent with how they were prior to the pandemic. In terms of other developments, the team have implemented a system of twice weekly discussions. So these are phone calls that happen twice a week with a number of partner agencies, and they exist to implement action plans or to review action plans that have previously been implemented on some complex cases that might require more joined up working or more of a multi-agency approach. So they were really developed more specifically in response to the increasing pressure on the multi-agency risk assessment conferences, the MARIC conferences, which are for high-risk victims. But what it's also done is it's created an opportunity for the dark service to refer in slightly more complex cases, or cases where they might be repeating a bit more frequently than feels, than you would want to see, but don't quite hit a threshold for the higher risk cases, and it creates that platform for those discussions to be had at a multi-agency level and for agencies to work together to look at how we can make sure that as many safety mechanisms and safeguarding mechanisms are put in place. In addition to this, the Drive project has been implemented in the Vale, and this is a new project which focuses on providing an intervention for perpetrators of high-risk cases. But again, the perpetrators are often the same perpetrators that are seen within the standard and medium cases as well. And it's been working effectively since September. It reached capacity quite quickly, as I'm sure you can imagine. It works with 31 perpetrators, and although it's still kind of early days to be drawing out any meaningful analysis, it's definitely delivering some positive outcomes at the moment. And that really concludes the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Benny, and I would like to say welcome to the committee as well. You haven't come and presented to us before, so thank you very much for coming today.
Thank you.
And I hope to see you again someday.
Thank you.
I do have one question and that question I have. I've got other people wanting to speak as well, so I will be very, very quick. The one question I have at the moment is. From the day we get the PPN or the MARAC, how long is the time between getting that notification and actually talking to the victim? What's the timeline like trying to get something in place?
So that's one of the team's targets, is to do that instantly. So where it would be next day during a working week. So we have a 72-hour limit to account for bank holidays, weekends, and times when the DARC coordinator wouldn't be in place. But it's an instant service, which is another one of its huge benefits, because prior to the DARC service, there would often be such a backlog because the risk assessors deal with a huge volume of PPNs that they just sometimes didn't have the time. So the backlog would mean that sometimes it would be kind of weeks and more worryingly so even months before they would get contacted, which I think, as we all know, when a victim is in a point of crisis, the support needs to be put in place immediately. One of the other advantages, because the DARC coordinator with consent contacts the victim also immediately, what the feedback that she's had, and this has definitely been has increased since the pandemic, is that it's been a real support to victims to have that platform to talk immediately with somebody and discuss kind of potential support options and interventions.
Okay, thank you very much. I used to work at Children's Services many years ago, so I was aware of the PPNs and MARACs and the fact that there used to be a backlog contacting families. So I'm glad to hear that things are being done now that would combat that. Councillor Brooks, I believe you're next.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the reports. It's a really, really good piece of work there, and I think, you know, it's a proven piece of work of the impact that you're having with the service, and it's fantastic to see about those awards, which are very well deserved. And I suppose one observation before my question is around the PPNs, and I think one of the things that doesn't mention there is, as a school governor, I think most of the school governors here would agree with myself, is that the schools have actually worked very well with those PPNs and the police as well, and it's around keeping that sort of extra pair of eyes and supporting those children who are in the school, because the schools are actually notified immediately, the PPNs as well, and I think it's had a positive impact there as well. My question really was, I was surprised in a little way that the data hasn't really changed that much during COVID, just simply down to the pressures of COVID. I think for most people, the isolation has often impacted on our own home situations. And I just wondered whether there's any sort of evidence or feeling around hidden abuse or hidden cases where people, if they're feeling isolated, then are actually afraid or wary, even threatened, whether there's that fear of them coming forward, and whether you've got any evidence to suggest that at all.
Absolutely. I think that's definitely one of the reasons why these safeguarding arrangements, the safeguarding groups that have been put together to look at these during the points of kind of lockdown and when we expected it to be at a point of kind of crisis, won't be going anywhere for now. I think we're going to continue to meet and to kind of continue to monitor this and to work closely with partners, because I think really that's at this stage that's all we can do, is to make sure that we're getting the information from as broad a spectrum as possible to kind of get a feel and have an understanding of whether or not, as you say, this is actually just a hidden and a repressed problem that just hasn't come to surface yet. It has been interesting, and I think across the rest of one of the things that I'll be doing is meeting with police analysts in the upcoming weeks to look at the year-end figures, because I think across the whole of the UK domestic abuse has risen, but it hasn't risen so significantly that it can be definitely attributed to COVID, as opposed to the general rise that's been occurring over the last few years anyway. So I think this is something, in fact I know that this is something that is going to be looked at a much wider level, not just kind of locally and not just with us. So we'll be working with our council colleagues as well to look at what seems to be happening and what safeguarding mechanisms we need to be keeping in place to respond to that. So I hope that's sort of answered.
That's fine, thank you, Chair.
Okay, I believe, looking at my little list here, Councillor Perks, you are next, and then it's Councillor Aviott.
Oh, thank you, Chair. I just wanted to also say, sort of this report, I think, reflects all the hard work that's undertaken by the DARC team. I know that we've had previous reports from yourselves, and it always, impresses me how much work that there needs to be done around this, and I was glad that the finances were there to keep the DARC team going for another year, and perhaps that's something that we can speak about at another time, about the yearly financial quest to keep this project going when it's a much needed support mechanism for people who are suffering domestic abuse, and I think the publicity that you talked about around social media was very prevalent during sort of the lockdown and stuff like that people actually did have sort of numbers that they could ring silently and things like that if they needed to, if they were in that dangerous position, and I think that was really useful. But going back to DARC, I think the work around the holistic work that's being undertaken with the other partners, I think is really important as well, and the twice weekly meetings that happen. I was impressed that the Drive project is now up and running within the Vale, and I suppose what I did want to ask sort of really is, so the Drive one is for high risk perpetrators. I just wondered if there's any sort of plans for any sort of programs for medium risk perpetrators that would stop them from becoming high risk. Thank you.
Yep, absolutely. It's something that has been it's definitely on the radar for such a long time. I think perpetrator work has just been absent from actually community provision for such a long time. Unfortunately, it was, as ever, it kind of comes down to funding. One of the Atalifer are working particularly. Well, one of Atalifer's particular priorities at the moment is to secure the money needed for children's programmes, I think, because that's seen to be one of the more immediate priorities, if we can actually say that one thing is a more immediate priority than another when it comes to this it's this enormously complex issue. But there is definitely a need to, a recognised need to invest in and to develop perpetrator programmes that work with perpetrators across the whole spectrum. I think especially considering this has been one of the advantages of the new kind of data collection system, is we're able to better track perpetrators and and see that actually perpetrators they repeat so often. There's generally not just one victim, there are generally a number of victims, so there's so much to kind of nip in the bud, and an earlier intervention would be much more effective, as I think we know across the board.
Thank you.
Mike, I don't know if that's I've
Come on in, Mike, if you want to.
Sorry, it was just to pick up on the question
Yeah, no worries.
that Councillor Brooks raised. The funding is recurring, so the £34,000 that's mentioned in the financial report is actually recurring funding, so it forms part of our base budget in community safety now going forward, so that's secure. And just to pick up on the point that Benny was saying with resources generally, we form part of a regional consortia with Cardiff in relation to our domestic violence, domestic abuse response, and it's one of the discussions that as a region we're aware of in terms of the lack of investment in perpetrator programmes, not just in Wales but across the country. So it is it will be a lobbying call for us as a region in our discussions with Welsh Government officials in terms of, I think it's about proving the benefit of and it goes back to the point that Benny was making with regard to how important data is and how data drives decision making. I think the fact that this is the first perpetrator programme we've had in the Vale, clearly, and in terms of the numbers, Benny mentioned that we're at capacity now. There probably are very many more perpetrators that could be supported if there was additional resources. So it will be a case of us lobbying Welsh Government and other interested statutory partners and saying, look, here's the data, here's the demand. We now need to look at this important area and provide additional resource because, you know, ultimately we have to deal with the perpetrators. We know that unless we deal with the root cause, it's a bit like prevention, isn't it? When we talk about the homeless strategy next, prevention is better than cure, isn't it? It's far cheaper. And in terms of outcomes, you know, you don't risk the outcomes that led to the dark coordinator service being piloted and then set up, which members will recall came as a result of a recommendation from a domestic homicide. And just to reflect on the point that Benny said about the criticality of information sharing, that was that has to be absolutely something that we need to resolve, whilst appreciating that victims may not wish necessarily to consent to wider agency involvement, and there would be a whole host of reasons why that may be. It could be, you know, issues in relation to perhaps social services or other agencies perhaps. So we fully understand that. So I think it is important that the training for the police who are obviously at that point of contact, that's critical, and I think that's mentioned in the report, that there will be a training requirement about, well, what does informed consent mean, and the fact that we're going to be providing an independent service that is just about support. It's not about anything else. It's about making sure that pathways are in place, that support mechanisms are in place to keep victims safe and their children. And I suppose just one last point to pick up on. I know Deb Gibbs, in terms of the aspect around children, was an area that she identified early on as being really key, because whilst the adults may be the victims of the initial abuse or violence, it's the impact on the children and the wider family. And of course we know about trauma-informed approaches in relation to responding to the needs of children, and obviously I welcome Councillor Brooks's comments around the importance of education and teachers as being part of that surveillance system with a small s, I suppose, that keeps people safe.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Councillor Aviat, if you'd like to ask your question.
Yeah, as a experience of domestic abuse over 10 years, myself and my children, I would like to hopefully form a group of people who've experienced this. It's okay, everybody making, you know, all these, it's great, all the agencies getting together, but I think it'd be good to have a group to get together and say, well, you know what, we didn't want to inform police because and social services, and just have the people who's had the experience and tell them the reasons why. And I think we could learn a lot from that. Because we can all make decisions, say, well, why don't you go to the police? But you can't, you know, sometimes you can't. And I would like to be part of a group to support people who are going through this or have been through this. And then maybe we can all work together and find a way forward. Thank you.
You've raised a good point there, Julie. Not everybody feels capable of being of going to the police. There is a lot of intimidation involved sometimes, and there is a lot of, for lack of a better term, brainwashing. So you end up believing that no one else would believe you, no one else wants you, no one else thinks you're worth anything, and you end up becoming very reliant on the abuser. So there are cases where you just don't feel that you can go to the police, and that is a case where, and that is a situation where you're kind of reliant on a neighbour ringing the police, or a friend turning up out of the blue and catching it happen, and then them calling the police. So that is something that there is a lot of difficulty around. So maybe more support groups in the Vale would be a good idea. That's all. Mike, you have your hands up again, and Benny.
I'm sorry, mine's legacy.
Oh, okay. Benny, if you would like to carry on, then thank you.
And I was just picking up on Councillor Aviott's point. It's really welcome to hear that actually one of the priorities for the Community Safety Partnerships Action Plan for the next 3 years is to look at increasing the engagement from people who've experienced, or people who have experience of either being victims or have experience through other ways, so that we have constantly, so that we always have victim informed and service user informed services, because I think, like you said, I mean, there's only so much that professionals can know, and you know, there's only so much support that can be created that way. So that's been identified as one of the priorities for the Community Safety Partnership, and is on the action plan for the next 3 years.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Wilkinson.
Can I ask, am I allowed to speak, please? As I'm not a member of this committee, even though I'm a cabinet member.
I'm going to have to refer that to Mark, because I'm not 100% sure myself.
Chair, that's perfectly fine, as long as the chair and the committee give permission, that's fine.
I'm happy with that. Are the rest of the committee in agreement? I don't see anyone objecting, so go ahead, Councillor Wilkinson.
Yes.
Thank you. I think listening here tonight, it's not just physically, it's mental abuse, and I just want to know, how could you engage with people like Julie, that's been involved with domestic abuse in quite a way, but how do you engage with it? How do you get people to come forward to join these groups? Can I ask that question, please?
Okay, who wants to come back on that one?
Yeah, I'm happy to.
Okay, go ahead.
So I think there are a number of different ways. I think, first of all, close engagement with our third sector provider is one of the most important ways, because they work directly with the victims in a support capacity. And the DARC coordinator is critical in establishing a referral pathway and a support package, but then very much passes on that victim and their family to the support providers who can provide that expert advice. So they're definitely one of the first points of call for that, because they have contact with the victim. So one of the roles that they have is to actively, and this is one of the things that we're working on with them, is to actively promote the platforms upon which people can come forward and either offer one-off bits of advice on how they feel services should be run, but always have open channels of communication for victims and for service users to be able to express the ways in which they feel services should be run and have that communication. And the second thing that we make sure that we do is to always ensure that there's consultation prior to establishing or to changing any towards doing anything with the services. So we try to make sure that where we target that consultation, we're likely to come across people who will have experience of the services that we're trying to change or develop, so that there's an opportunity for people to come forward that way. And we make use of our social media platforms to have polls and to have kind of more subtle, perhaps, ways of encouraging people to come forward. Because it's not always easy to come forward face to face, and it's not a comfortable topic of communication for many people. Most people don't want to necessarily have face to face or prolonged conversations about what they feel services should offer. So we try and offer opportunities for people to just kind of text in or offer small snippets of information that we can then take on board. And again, as Mike said, we also work regionally, so we have access to a much wider...
I'm sorry, Mrs. Smith, could you please mute yourself? Thank you. Sorry, carry on, Benny.
That's fine. We have access to much wider victim-led support groups who then have the capacity to disseminate through communities that they know will effectively be able to target people who have been victims themselves, or who are victims themselves, who might want to come forward and help with the development of services. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that's fine. I was just wondering how, because with Councillor Aviat, I know she has quite a bit of experience in that, and I have people knocking here over the years, even into the early hours of the morning, and I have to take them in and then get the police involved and the council, and I know a little bit about it, but when people has been into the situation, they can give their ideas more and speak openly. Thank you for that anyway. Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to speak.
No problem, Councillor Wilkinson.
Can I say thank you to Councillor Collins? I think she's done a good job tonight.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you very much. Okay, I don't see anybody else with their hands up to discuss this now, so I'm just going to ask that we move the recommendations and just maybe add a recommendation in there regarding what Julie has said about speaking with people who have got more experience about this and setting up possibly a support group of some kind. When is the next report due? That's the other question I meant to ask, sorry. Yeah. When is the next report due? Does anybody know? Benny, Mike?
I think Mike's frozen. I was hoping to defer to Mike. I don't, but I can find out. And
Mike, can you hear us? Mike, you're frozen. Can you hear us at all? Come back on the point the chair's just made.
I can certainly bring the response back to committee.
I think that might have to be the case if we can't get Mike back. Okay, yes, if you could just let us know as soon as you can when the next report will be. I'm going to move on to the next item on the agenda, which is the homelessness prevention strategy, but unfortunately Mike is leading on that, so I'm hoping he can come back in. Maybe Kate will be.
Yeah, hi, sorry. Yeah, Mike is leading on this. I'm Kate Hollinshead. I'm the recently appointed Housing Solutions and Supporting People team leader.
Okay.
Mike was going to lead on this agenda item, but if he's not able to reconnect, I'm happy to lead if everyone else is happy with that.
You.
Okay, bear with me a minute.
Welcome to the committee as well.
Thank you very much. I think I'm at the next one doing a different presentation. So I realised.
Sorry, Kate, just let you know Mike has just rejoined.
Oh, there we go. Great. In that case, I will defer back to Mike to lead on it, and I will just join in as needed.
Okay.
I'm very sorry. I'm very sorry, Chair. I lost my internet connection.
It happens. It happens. We are now on agenda item number 6, which is the homeless prevention strategy. So if you would like to pick up where you need to, please, Mike.
No, excuse me, no problem. obviously you've been introduced obviously to Kate. Kate has been in post probably about 2 months now, I think, and was promoted into her current position following the resignation of the previous post holder. So Kate has a sort of dual responsibility, not only in relation to housing related support, but also in terms of the Housing Solutions Service. So one of the discussions, and obviously we'll have with regard to this report, is the fact that it's an end-to-end process. So it's about prevention, but it's also about support and options and solutions that we provide. But as I say, I'd like to welcome Kate to the meet. I know Kate has been before, but I don't think there we go. So, but not in this position. Coming back to the report, then, members of the committee will have seen this report previously in terms of updates on the homelessness prevention strategy and its action plan. Just to very briefly go over the background for members that may not be aware, Cabinet adopted the Housing Prevention Strategy in June 2019. There was a statutory requirement under the Housing Act, the Wales Housing Act 2014, which placed a duty on the local authority to provide a strategy. Going through the report, there is preamble there, which I know most members are aware of. But in terms of the key issues, the 4 key themes in the strategy and in the action plan associated with that, they're covered off there at 2.1. So effectively, it's about targeted prevention, availability of housing advice and assistance, and I think that probably talks a little bit to the previous item that we just had, and perhaps Kate may throw some light on the discussion we were having around engagement with service users, because of course Atholl Row are funded in the main through commissioning from the Housing Support Grant. So Kate probably will have something to say there about how we can support users to not self-help in that sort of sense, but to have support from others in similar situations. Thirdly, obviously, that we provide support to the most vulnerable, to enable them to maintain their homes and integrate into the community. And lastly, to improve the support to private landlords. And as many members will be aware, and for those on the Task and Finish group, you will understand how important the private sector is to us in being able to deliver our statutory requirements. In terms of the plan, just some housekeeping about the plan. The plan has a number of actions. They are ranked in low, medium and high, and as it's a 4-year strategy, there's an indication within the prioritisation about when those actions should be achieved. And I think what I'd like to say is there's tremendous involvement of staff to be able to deliver the strategic actions in the middle of what has been a very, very difficult period, which I know we've discussed previously. And of all the actions that are actually attached within Appendix 1 to the strategy, there's only 3 actions that we haven't progressed. And they're fairly obvious ones, really, about close contact. So hospital discharge procedures have not taken place. Staff shadowing, which is, we think that is important. I mentioned the end-to-end process. I think it's very important for my staff to understand their role in delivering a whole holistic service, and delivery of tenancy-ready training within the prison system, which clearly has been extremely difficult and impossible actually in the last 12 months. At 2.5, I know I've mentioned figures previously in bringing these reports, but I think it's worth reflecting. The team have dealt with 3,500 homelessness inquiries since March 2020, and in that time we've placed 527 households in all forms of our temporary accommodation, and we currently have, I think it's probably a little bit more than 92. Numbers have increased fairly recently, and I've given authority to extend the allocation of additional units of bed and breakfast in one of our hotels. But at the time of writing, there were 92 households in B&B and 113 in our other forms of temporary accommodation. One of the important things, but during the pandemic, as we say, that it's sort of been business as usual in terms of delivering some of the key actions. And one of the key actions we wanted to bring to your attention today as a committee is the importance of obviously our LGBTQ plus community, and particularly under the youth homelessness report out of the door. And I'm pleased to be able to say that during the pandemic and remotely through Teams, we've been able to deliver an LGBTQ plus champion, and we provided training to 66 members of my team in housing and building services, and that's both across the front line and in our senior management roles. And hopefully the understanding and the learning that we've been able to take advantage of there will support us then in terms of the ways that we develop our policy going forward, and understand that some of our policy actually deflects and prevents people from coming to us from service, just in the way that we use words and language which doesn't provide a welcoming response for that community. We go on to talk about the units of B&B, and there's a reflection there that out of the 92 households that we've accommodated, you can see a significant proportion of those people are single occupants under 35. The majority of those people either wouldn't have been clients that we would have had responsibility for under legislation because they wouldn't have been deemed to be priority, or they would have been people who were hidden homeless, people who were sofa surfing or staying short term with friends, family, that didn't have suitable, sustainable accommodation. And hence, one of the discussions we'll be having at Task and Finish is about move on and how do we assist those residents to actually move into more sustainable, suitable housing solutions. I mentioned the importance of the private sector, and just to flag up at 2.8 why that is. Clearly, we rely on private rented accommodation to provide secure and suitable accommodation for a large proportion of our clients. Clearly, there is not enough social housing, and we obviously have to work with landlords within our locality to assist us in delivering our statutory responsibilities. That's been difficult because obviously we rely on vacancies coming to us from private landlords. And of course, we haven't seen an awful lot of vacancies actually come into the market, partly down to the fact that people are not moving as frequently as they were, and partly down to the fact that turnover, particularly for those landlords that have issues with tenants with antisocial behaviour or with rent arrears, I mean, it's not really the answer, because you make somebody homeless in order to create a vacancy, which is what 2.8 to a certain extent is saying. However, it is obvious that the impact of a 6-month notice period, fundamentally for private landlords, for them, they perceive as increasing the risk on them in terms of their properties. And in the main, we rely on small 1, 2, 3 property landlords, to provide us with property. It's not the multinational private sector, that perhaps are in it clearly for gain and profit. But as I say, that is having an impact, and we are having some conversations with some of our landlords who are requiring, in terms of bonds and rents in advance, certainly up to 6 months worth of funding. So Sorry, can people hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now. You froze
Right.
for a second or two, but you're back.
Oh, apologies. I'll tell my son to get off his game station now. So it's just the importance of the private sector. I shan't talk you through the action plan. I think the action plan, there's an update on every action there detailed under February 2021. But of course, Kate and I would be pleased to pick up on any individual questions that you might have. Thanks very much, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Kate, would you like to say anything now, or would you like to see if there's any questions?
I'm happy to wait for any questions, but I suppose if I should just pick up on the one point that Mike said about the service user involvement for domestic abuse. Yeah, because obviously being supporting people lead prior to this and still overseeing the programme at Alafro, where our commission provider for that, they do a lot of service user involvement, but obviously we are fully aware that it's only the people who actually come forward. There are a lot of people hidden out there, which they are the people that are almost impossible to tap into in terms of any of our service user involvement. But you know, we are constantly looking at new and innovative ways. You know, how can we do things through social media and through, you know, sort of technological solutions, asking people to come forward. But service user involvement is at the heart of the Supporting People programme, or well, now the Housing Support Grant programme, but it can take a while for us all to remember that one. So yeah, so it is at the heart of it, and we are constantly working with Alafro and all of our other providers to try and bring that forward. But yeah, more than happy to take any other questions, anything.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions? I don't, because I've discussed this with Mike a little while ago, so he brought me up to speed on it and I asked my questions then. But does anybody else have any? Sally, Councillor Hanks, if you would like to speak.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I would just like to say how much, and I think we all agree, how much we appreciate the unprecedented, continuous hard work that the pandemic has caused for the homeless prevention team, and I'd like to say a big thank you to them.
Thank you. I will pass that across to the team.
That is
Second
much echoed back among us all, I believe.
Yes.
Yes, definitely.
Yes, agree.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, let's have a look. 2 seconds, I've lost my page. Just looking at the recommendations when I can find the right page.
On page 2, Chair, the report.
Yeah, I found it now. Sorry. I dropped the papers earlier. So the recommendations are that the Scrutiny Committee continues to note the progress to date in implementing the Homeless Prevention Strategy and Action Plan, that the Homes and Safe Communities Scrutiny Committee note the additional actions included and the significant pressures on the service, its staff and resources as a result of the COVID pandemic. I am quite happy to accept those recommendations.
Happy to recommend, yeah, happy to second.
Brilliant. I don't see anybody in disagreement.
Happy to support.
Okay, thank you. I think that's the last item. So I have nothing in part 1 that has been decided as urgent and nothing in part 2. So the date of the next meeting is, when is the date of the next meeting? I can't remember.
Bear with me, Chair. I will bring up the date now.
Yeah, I did have it and now I've forgotten it. Sorry.
No problem, Chair. I'll bring that up now. The next meeting will be Wednesday, the 12th of May.
Thanks. So, as I said, I have nothing which is urgent, so I will bid you a fond farewell and see you all on the 12th of May. Thank you very much for coming tonight and thank you all for your time.
Good night, Chair.